I was working as a speech language pathologist for 13 years at the master's level, and I had always been interested in fluency disorders, specifically at that time stuttering, because I didn't know about cluttering. And then in my first job in 1993, I worked with a little boy who I said, this doesn't seem like stuttering. And I came across an article that talked about cluttering. And I was like, wow, what is this cluttering? And I became very interested in it, but that was the only client I saw really, I think, over all that time, and still until I started to go work for a private practice. And then I saw some more clients with cluttering. And at the time I thought it was a language disorder. And then around that time, this was 2005, I decided to go back to get my doctorate because I wanted to understand how to do good research. I had tried to do research, but I really didn't have the training. So I made a lot of flaws. And I went back to get my doctorate, and I studied with John Tetnowski, and he was kind enough to let me study whatever I wanted. And I said, cluttering. That's it. I want to study cluttering. And it's a language disorder. And we had an international conference coming up in Dublin. And I knew that Ken St. Louis was going to be there. He and I had some email conversations about cluttering, but never met. And I said to John, when we go to IFA, I must meet Ken St. Louis. And that was really, I didn't know a lot of the other literature either. I only knew like some of the literature here. I didn't even at that time know about the Days-of-Weiss stuff, very naively. And I just thought cluttering was a language disorder because it felt like that to me. And so John was like, okay, and introduced me to Ken St. Louis. And, we had a lovely chat. And within the first 15 minutes or so, he got me to thinking about how he said, I understand why you think cluttering is a language disorder. He said, but we do know people who clutter who do not necessarily exhibit language problems. And that sounds very basic, but it was like an epiphany to me as like a new doctoral researcher. I was like, well, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So then he started talking to me about the LCD definition of cluttering that he was working on at that time. And flash forward several years later it might not even have been several, it may have been 1 or 2 years later, was the first World Congress on cluttering. And that I said, I don't care where in the world this conference is, I'm going. So that shaped a lot of my views too, because I met some adults who clutter there and who did not have a language disorder. So I kind of started going down the road and understanding better from a research perspective, at least, that when we're putting all these different characteristics into cluttering, it makes it very hard to do a controlled research study. So the LCD, that's why I think it's probably the most controlled definition we have now, as opposed to like, if you look at Days-of-Weiss, that definition was way too broad. And then, how do you know who you're studying? So that made me think more about the LCD definition. And then, that always has resonated with me. And then I've used that more clinically to diagnose and treat cluttering, but recognizing that there may be other symptoms as well that have to be treated, but I just don't necessarily look at it as those other symptoms are necessarily part of cluttering. I think that when you say language planning, that resonates more to me with executive functioning versus a true language problem that we as speech language pathologists know. So like there's something called a specific language disorder where people will have trouble with grammatical structures, trouble with vocabulary, right? So it's kind of basic language trouble, but many, I won't say all, but many of the people who clutter that I work with, they don't exhibit that true language disorder. It's more, as you say, in the planning, which I see as more an executive functioning, like all of the language that is needed is intact. It's the same as your typical non-cluttering speaker, but it's the organizing of it that's the problem, more an executive functioning problem. I mean, there is, you probably know of it because I think it's mentioned in your book that we have the one fMRI study where they looked at the brain imaging and found some of the issues more in planning. There was a study prior to that that looked at more language organization, and it was also by David Ward's prior doctoral student Jessica Bretherton Furness. So they kind of go together and track that language planning, language organization, and then I'm working on some things to try to show that there's a difference between a true language disorder and a language planning. And I don't know if everyone sees it that way. For some people, that may be a matter of semantics. But I feel like if you work with, you know, a child, like I've worked with a lot of children with true language disorders, no cluttering, and it's just very different. That's definitely one of the theories, and that theory resonates with me with what I've seen. I think when someone with a true language problem slows down, it will be better for them, but it won't completely go away, right? And I do have a client right now who I think probably also has language problems. So the slowing down helps a lot, the pausing helps a lot, but there's still a difference between someone who has more of a planning problem and they slow down and put the pauses in, the language just tends to normalize. The general population, no. And we've been trying so hard, you know, with the ICA, and thank you for all your work with it. You know, we've been trying from the beginning to really spread the word, but there's still a lot of myths that persist, and we still see the myths on social media, and we still see things like, well, this client is not stuttering, they're talking, you know, really fast, and then other therapists are discounting it on social media, and we're thinking, oh, but that could be cluttering, you know. Yeah. It's better, but we have a long way to go. Well, I think this is going to help tremendously. There's a lot of obstacles. One of them was really, I feel like in stuttering, the field has really been guided by the people who stutter over time. And I always said we needed that in cluttering. And we always had, you know, Joe Dewey, like, you know, one of our first people to speak about it. But I think now the more available things are, more social media, that is really helping. It's going to help so much. And I think the consumers like you putting your ideas out there are really going to help. I think the barriers that I have found are just making sure that your everyday therapist knows about all of the resources out there. A lot of times I find that people will, you know, send me an email and say, I found your PowerPoint at ASHA and I have a question. I think someone's cluttering. And I'll say, you know, oh, by the way, you know, this isn't a sales pitch, but I do have a book. And the reason I do that is because, you know, I wrote the books so that therapists could have answers to their questions. And they always say they don't even know it existed. So I think that's a barrier, is the therapist knowing places to go. I'm so glad we have like the ICA website, but I still think for some reason they go to the Facebook page, and it may, or not the Facebook cluttering page, but, you know, other speech pathologist pages, and they may not always get the accurate information. I do think there's still a lot of misunderstanding, but I do think if you look at it in a general sense, when I've spoken with people and they've said I've tried something, their inclination is to go to something that's going to slow a person down, like a delayed auditory feedback or a pacing board, or like tapping out the syllables. And I think those things are fine in the short term. It's just, I think they need to understand the intricacies of cluttering a little more, and also like, okay, so I can tell someone to slow down, but what if that doesn't completely work? And what if that makes them sound unnatural? And, you know, is there, like, I like to focus on a more natural way to do that than with devices and things that they can't maintain, or that may make, I don't know, them sound or feel atypical. But that's just, my style is more pragmatic and it's more low tech in terms of that. And I don't think people always go to that. They go more to the devices and the pacing, but then they don't necessarily know how to bridge it. I'm talking about people who have less experience and would just intuitively go to that. They don't know how to bridge it to real life, you know? So
Yeah.
that's probably the gap.